This is TWiT. The more I think about it, the more I realize we do need to talk about the FCC blocking the sale of Chinese technology to protect national security. Now, this is a story that we've talked about a little bit in passing for the last couple of weeks, and it's getting hot. A Chinese technology vendor Huawei and ZTE could soon be prevented from selling products to U.S. companies and organizations that receive broadband funding from the FCC. In other words, the FCC is using their programs that provide broadband expansion funds to say, if you deal with those companies, you will no longer get those funds. FCC Chairman Ajit Pai's new proposal would prevent the USF, that's the Universal Service Fund, from being used to purchase equipment or services from any communication equipment or service providers identified as posing a national security risk to communication networks or the communication supply chain. And again, those vendors identified have been Huawei and ZTE. Now, these proposals, this whole taking away USF from companies that are going to use those vendors, comes just as President Donald Trump has imposed new tariffs and other penalties on Chinese goods. So this is seen as sort of a tit for tat. This is a bit more of a push, a bit more incentive for China to make a deal. But the proposed FCC policy has in its roots that 2012 congressional report that said that both Huawei and ZTE equipment should not be used by U.S. government systems because of their ties to the Chinese government. The report also encouraged private U.S. companies to consider the long-term security risks associated with doing business with either of those two companies for equipment or services. In other words, they want them to seek other vendors. Chibert, we have to be very careful about what we say here because I think the confidentiality of the NOC still applies, and we still have friends and we still have a presence in this business. But this is something that actually even predates 2012. This has been around basically since Huawei and ZTE started making equipment, right?
No, this has been around, or at least this attitude within Capitol Hill has been around ever since the Chinese company Lenovo bought the ThinkPad line from IBM.
Yep.
Remember that time when the ThinkPads were coming preloaded with malware?
Yep. Which they didn't call it malware, by the way. They said, no.
This is a feature.
It's a feature. We like this. Yeah.
The federal government is basically saying, we don't think you should use this gear because we're afraid it's going to phone home. I think that's the bottom line, right? Well,
kind of. Actually, I want to bring Curtis into this discussion, and I want to do it by talking about an episode of New Screensavers I did with Leo Laporte about 2 weeks ago. One of the mailbag questions, those are the questions we ask at the end of the show, was from a user who wanted to know if it was possible for him to buy a phone that was in no way, shape, or form made in, constructed in, assembled in China. And he was worried about spyware. He was worried about what we're talking about in this story. And we discussed this. We said, yes, there are some manufacturers that don't touch China at all, that actually make all their components elsewhere. However, the bigger problem, and Chibert, I'm with you on this, is the bigger problem is at some point, if you want that device to be useful, it's got to communicate with the larger network of the internet. And there's so much of that is run by Huawei and has ZTE equipment in it. And as you mentioned, we don't really know. We haven't done a thorough study on whether or not that equipment phones home or what it does. Curtis, is this a concern on the enterprise side? Because, I mean, Huawei has been incredibly aggressive with pricing. They have provided some decent equipment. I had an experience like Chibert where, for some reason, there was a Huawei switch that kept breaking my VPNs. But as it turned out, it was just a really, really poorly designed piece of equipment. It wasn't malicious. Is this just rumor? Is this the slander? Or is there actually something here?
I tend to think that there may well be something here. And my concern, and the concern of a lot of people, isn't so much with the endpoint devices, the phones and the laptops, as it is with the big core routers. It's easy to forget that Huawei is one of, realistically, about a half dozen companies on Earth that is capable of bidding on projects to provide the very largest core routers for major corporations and ISPs.
It's like what? It's Huawei, it's Cisco, HP, Huawei, maybe Juniper, maybe Extreme. I don't know with that acquisition. Maybe they're more edge. Yeah.
And I tend to think there's probably at least one European still in there, but it's a very, very limited vendor community. And those are devices, I mean, face it, if you really wanted to do massive surveillance of data, it's far more efficient to do the collection at the core router than it is to do it from millions upon millions of endpoints. So is it a concern to the enterprise? Oh, absolutely. I am reasonably certain that there are companies out there that for various reasons would not ever consider a core router from Huawei, because they know that they would get serious questions from their government-based clients if they did. Others follow those companies' leads. This has become a major issue for Huawei, and they're becoming more and more aggressive in trying to address it. As you say, I've seen press releases on new equipment, and there's no question that they are very, very aggressive on their list prices, which means that when the sales folks come to talk, they're going to be doing wheeling and dealing that makes these products really difficult for someone who has bean counters looking over their shoulder to pass up.